The Atlantic, once fully entered, ceases to present itself as distance and becomes instead an atmosphere. There is a particular threshold in every crossing when the memory of departure loses its immediacy. Yet the promise of arrival remains abstract. It is within that threshold that the navigator's discipline is most thoroughly tested. Not by violence, nor by uncertainty, but by endurance. The wind had steadied into a faithful pattern. It arrived from the east with sufficient constancy that the sails required only minor trimming at the change of each watch. The vessel leaned with modest inclination, her bow dividing the swell without resistance. The creak of timber had settled into a predictable cadence, no longer a complaint, but a language of adjustment. I rose before dawn as I had each morning since the first day beyond the river's mouth. The air at that hour held a coolness that would later dissolve beneath the sun, though here in open water even warmth arrives with restraint. The horizon, uninterrupted in all directions, carried the faintest gradient of pale light before the sun's ascent. In those early minutes, the sea reflects the sky's hesitance. The surface appears metallic, subdued, as though awaiting instruction. I cast the log line with deliberate care. The knotted intervals slipped from the coil and into the sea, each marked by the measured count of sand through the glass. When the call was made, the line was drawn back in, heavy with salt. The calculation required no correction. We advanced as expected. Expectation, however, must never replace confirmation. I entered the numbers into the logbook and allowed my hand to rest briefly upon the page. The ink, slightly thickened by humidity, required a moment longer to settle. The crew stirred gradually, footsteps upon the deck, the low murmur of conversation, the clatter of simple utensils against wood. There is comfort in such small sounds when the larger world offers only wind and water. By mid-morning the swell had lengthened further, rising beneath us in broad, dignified arcs. The vessel responded without protest. Each descent into the trough felt less abrupt than in earlier days, as though the sea itself had resolved into steadiness. Flying fish began to appear in brief flashes, startling silver arcs that broke the surface and vanished again within moments. Their presence drew brief laughter from younger crewmen. Even disciplined men require interruption. Toward noon, the sky revealed a clearer window than had been granted in previous days. I brought the sextant to my eye once more, aligning the lower limb of the sun with the trembling horizon. The vessel's motion complicates precision. One must anticipate the swell's rise and fall, allowing the instrument to settle into alignment at the precise moment of balance. The angle confirmed our latitude within tolerable variance. There is no triumph in accuracy at sea. There is only quiet affirmation. The captain joined me shortly thereafter. "You are content with our progress?" he asked. "Content is not the word," I replied. "We are aligned." He considered that for a moment. "Alignment will suffice." He lingered beside me. gazing outward across the unbroken horizon. Men grow restless when nothing changes, he said at length. Nothing changes visibly, I corrected. Much changes beneath. He regarded me sidelong. You speak of currents, of patience. He allowed the faintest inclination of his head before returning to his duties. Restlessness aboard ship rarely manifests in open defiance. It emerges instead in subtle inefficiencies. Tasks performed without full attention, glances cast too frequently toward the horizon, conversations revisited without purpose. I took note of these small shifts. The sea remained vast, and we sailed on. By the 40th day beyond the last sight of Spain, the Atlantic had ceased to feel like a body of water, and had instead become the condition in which we existed. The notion of departure had faded. The promise of arrival remained theoretical. Between those 2 points lay nothing but repetition, measured in wind, swell, and discipline. The trade winds had settled into a steady breath that neither faltered nor surged. They pressed against the canvas with consistency that bordered on indifference. The sails remained full, the lines taut without strain, the hull angled just enough to suggest forward purpose. The sound of wind along rigging no longer drew attention. It had become a background tone against which all other perception was measured. Morning followed morning with little variation in appearance. Before the sun lifted itself above the horizon, the sea wore a metallic sheen, subdued and colourless, reflecting the sky's hesitation. I rose before the bell, as habit required, and moved to the rail, testing the air with a slow inhalation. The scent was unchanged, salt, faint timber, distant moisture. I cast the log line in silence. The knotted cord slid over the stern and into the wake, disappearing in measured increments. The sand glass emptied at its appointed interval. The line was retrieved wet and heavy, and the count announced. The numbers agreed with expectation. Agreement is not excitement. It is affirmation. I entered the figure into the logbook with deliberate script, allowing the ink to settle before closing the cover. The book had grown thick with entries, each line nearly identical in structure, each day distinguished only by subtle degrees of variation. The crew moved about the deck with compliance rather than vigour. Fatigue had not broken them, it had settled upon them. Their steps were slower, though still precise. Speech was economical, laughter rare but not absent. On the 42nd day, a quiet tension surfaced without clear origin. It did not erupt into argument. It manifested instead in silence, prolonged, heavy, unshared. 2 men avoided eye contact over a trivial misplacement of tools. Another lingered too long at the rail, staring westward as though land might rise from insistence alone. The captain observed without interference. He did not chastise idleness. He did not rally them with speech. He allowed the crossing itself to instruct. That evening, as the sun lowered in muted orange behind thin haze, he joined me near the helm. "They count days," he said quietly. "They will count weeks," I replied. "And when they lose count, they will remember discipline. He studied the horizon, then the compass. You speak as though the sea is patient. It is, I said, with those who are. The stars emerged gradually after dusk, first faint and hesitant, then in greater number as the darkness deepened. The sky had cleared entirely for the first time in several nights. I brought the sextant from its case and aligned the instrument with the horizon. The swell complicated the angle. The vessel rose and fell with measured insistence. I waited through multiple oscillations before taking the reading, timing the alignment at the brief instant of balance. The altitude confirmed our latitude with reassuring precision. Polaris sat lower than in the early days of the voyage, yet steady. Other constellations had shifted subtly in their ascent. I traced their positions without urgency, marking each in the logbook with the same restrained script. Navigation at night requires stillness within motion. The sea moves, the vessel moves, the sky appears fixed. It is the navigator who must reconcile all three. Below deck the warmth had intensified. The timbers retained heat through the night. Sleep came reluctantly to many. I heard the turning of bodies in narrow berths, the quiet exhalations of men adjusting to confinement. I returned to my cabin and unfolded the letter once more. My dear Isabel, the sea has become both road and dwelling. We move steadily west, yet distance no longer presents itself as progress. It is simply continuity. The men endure. The captain remains firm without harshness. The wind serves us faithfully. I paused. How does one describe sameness without diminishing it? There is a peace in repetition when fear has departed. The sea does not threaten. It merely persists. I set down the pen and allowed the lantern's light to flicker against the cabin wall. The motion of the hull beneath my feet had become so familiar that its absence would have been more unsettling than its presence. On the 45th day, a bank of cloud rose unexpectedly to the southwest. It did not carry the vertical aggression of storm, but rather a slow accumulation that dimmed the horizon gradually. The wind freshened by a modest degree, enough to require attention but not alarm. The captain ordered minor adjustments to sail. No urgency attended the command. The sea responded with slightly shortened swell. The bow met the water with a firmer cadence. Spray reached the forward deck in finer sheets. The crew adjusted without complaint. I recalculated our drift conservatively, accounting for the altered wind angle. The compass needle remained faithful, though its movement appeared exaggerated by the vessel's increased pitch. "Hold steady," I instructed the helmsman. He did. Rain arrived briefly near midnight, not in sheets but in fine persistent lines that blurred the boundary between sea and sky. The horizon dissolved entirely. For a time the world consisted only of wind and motion. I remained beside the helm, counting intervals by glass, adjusting course by degrees too small to register outwardly. In such hours, navigation becomes interior. The sky offers no guidance. The sea provides no markers. One relies upon accumulated memory, wind direction before cloud, swell orientation before darkness. The vessel's preferred lean when true to course. By dawn, the cloud thinned, and the rain ceased. The sea resumed its longer breathing. We had neither wandered nor deviated beyond correction. The crew's spirits lifted slightly in the renewed light. Flying fish scattered before the bow in quick silver arcs. The air held warmth even at early hour. I tested the water temperature again by bucket and found it risen another slight degree. Change continued beneath steadiness. Days later, faint strands of floating vegetation appeared intermittently in our wake. Thin, unremarkable, easily dismissed by an untrained eye. I did not dismiss them. Currents carry memory of land long before land is visible. I adjusted nothing. Instead, I allowed expectation to remain internal. The crossing had entered its long middle. The Atlantic no longer challenged us with spectacle. It demanded endurance without distraction. And so, we sailed on. By the 50th day west of Spain, the sea had grown so constant that even its immensity no longer impressed the senses. The Atlantic did not rage, nor did it calm. It persisted in long, deliberate breathing, lifting the hull and lowering it again with patient repetition. The horizon remained unbroken in every direction, a perfect ring dividing water from sky with almost mathematical precision. If a man stared too long at that line, he might begin to doubt whether movement truly occurred at all. Yet we moved. The log confirmed it each morning. The wake streamed aft in a pale ribbon beneath the stern. The compass needle held its quiet allegiance to the west-southwest. And each evening, when the stars cleared sufficiently to permit measurement, the numbers in the book aligned with expectation. We were not drifting. We were not circling. We were advancing, though nothing in the visible world seemed to acknowledge that fact. The crew had adjusted to the crossing in the way men adjust to seasons. The restlessness that had stirred weeks earlier had settled into a steadier discipline. Conversation came in measured intervals, rarely rising above the pitch of wind along the rigging. Tasks were performed without flourish. Even fatigue had found its place within routine. A man might yawn at the rail, stretch his shoulders against stiffness, then return to his duty without complaint. On a morning of unusual clarity, the sky opened without a single thread of cloud. The light at dawn was pale and clean, casting the sea in faint silver. I stood beside the foremast and watched the swell approach from the east in long, even lines. Each crest bore a darker edge, its shadow deepening before passing beneath us. The hull responded with gentle ascent and descent, neither abrupt nor hesitant. There is a moment, during prolonged passages, when the sea ceases to be an obstacle and becomes instead a companion. It offers no encouragement, yet it no longer feels adversarial. One begins to understand its rhythm not as force, but as condition. The Atlantic does not oppose the vessel. It simply exists, and we exist within it. Near midday, the wind shifted slightly northward. The change was subtle enough that only the angle of sail revealed it at first. Canvas fluttered once, then filled again at a marginally altered orientation. The captain noted it without comment and signalled for minor adjustment. The crew responded with quiet coordination, easing one line, tightening another. The ship resumed her preferred lean. Such small alterations marked our days. I measured the sun at its height with careful patience, allowing the instrument to settle despite the vessel's steady motion. The angle differed only modestly from the previous day, yet the progression was undeniable. Latitude confirmed our steady descent toward warmer waters. I marked the figure in the logbook and closed it gently, aware that numbers carry a comfort beyond their practical function. They reassure the mind when the eyes perceive only sameness. The heat had grown more pronounced in recent days. By late afternoon, the deck planks warmed beneath the hand. The air, though moving steadily, carried a thickness absent earlier in the voyage. The men shed outer layers where propriety allowed. Water consumption increased. I ordered the casks inspected and the distribution monitored, not from concern but from prudence. Flying fish appeared more frequently now, scattering in glimmering arcs before the bow. Their bodies flashed briefly in sunlight before vanishing again into the deep. They did not signal land. They signaled warmth. That evening, as twilight gathered slowly across the western sky, the sea reflected the fading light in muted bronze tones. The horizon softened rather than sharpened. I remained at the rail longer than required, allowing the slow dimming to settle the mind. "You look for something," the captain observed quietly as he approached. "I look for continuity," I replied. He considered this, then rested his hands upon the rail beside mine. "There is no break in it," he said. "No," I answered, "but sometimes the mind seeks one." We stood without speech as darkness completed its descent. The stars revealed themselves gradually. First the brighter bodies, then the faint lattice that fills the spaces between. The sky in these latitudes seemed broader somehow, the arc of constellations more expansive. I took bearings with deliberate calm, aligning the sextant against a horizon nearly indistinguishable in the dark. The vessel's rise and fall complicated precision, yet practice compensates for motion. Each reading confirmed what instinct already suggested. We held true. Below deck, the crew prepared for the night watches. Lantern light flickered along timbered walls, casting elongated shadows that swayed gently with the hull. Sleep came more readily now that discipline had settled into the bones. Even the younger sailors who once counted days aloud had ceased such habit. Time no longer required announcement. During the second watch, clouds gathered in low formations far to the south. They did not approach with menace, yet their presence altered the horizon's texture. The wind freshened briefly, then steadied again. I adjusted my estimates conservatively, allowing for drift that might not yet reveal itself. The sea beneath us darkened to a deeper indigo, almost black, though its motion remained unchanged. Phosphorescence began to trail faintly in our wake, small sparks igniting and extinguishing in the churned water. It was not brilliant, but persistent, as though the ocean marked our passage in quiet acknowledgement. I rested my hands upon the rail and felt the steady vibration of the hull beneath my palms. Wood against water, wind against canvas, man against distance. On the 53rd day, a calm fell so gently that it might have been mistaken for imagination. The wind did not cease entirely, but it softened to a low breath. The sails hung with diminished tension. The vessel's forward motion continued, yet more languidly. No order was given. The sea flattened slightly, reducing its long arc to smaller undulations. The soundscape shifted with it. Where once the rigging hummed steadily, now it creaked intermittently. The hull no longer cut the water with firm insistence, but parted it with quiet persistence. Such calms test patience differently than storms. Storms demand action. Calms demand endurance. The crew sensed the change and moved with slower steps, as though mirroring the sea's restraint. Conversations rose briefly, then settled again. No one spoke of delay, yet all understood that progress, though continuing, had diminished. I took new measurements at noon and confirmed that our movement remained measurable, slower but steady. "It is enough," the captain said after reviewing the figures. "It is," I agreed. The sky remained clear for 2 days thereafter, the sun descending each evening in uninterrupted brilliance. Heat intensified on deck. The air carried a faint sweetness, not previously present, though so subtle that it might have been suggestion rather than scent. I did not speak of it. There is a danger in announcing anticipation before it is certain. Instead, I continued my routine without alteration. By the 55th night, the swell resumed its earlier breadth. The wind returned with quiet confidence, filling canvas more fully once again. The vessel leaned into its course with renewed assurance. The wake brightened faintly beneath starlight. The crossing was not yet complete, but the sea had shifted in character. Not visibly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. We sailed on. On the 58th evening since the last outline of Spain had dissolved into memory, the sky opened with unusual clarity. The horizon stood clean and sharp, dividing sea from firmament with precise distinction. The air held warmth even after sunset, though a faint current of cooler breath drifted across the deck as darkness deepened. Such nights are gifts to a navigator. The swell remained long and dignified, lifting the vessel in measured arcs that allowed for steadier sighting than usual. I brought the sextant from its case with deliberate care, wiping a trace of salt from the glass before raising it toward the stars. Polaris shone steady above the northern horizon, though lower than when we began. I aligned its reflection against the dark line of sea, waiting through the vessel's rise and fall until the arc settled into balance. The angle held firm. I recorded the altitude carefully. Then I turned to other bodies, Arcturus descending, Vega bright in the east, the subtle arc of lesser stars forming their quiet geometry overhead. Each reading required patience. Each confirmation reinforced the integrity of our course. Navigation at night is not merely calculation. It is reconciliation. The sea moves. The vessel moves. The sky appears unmoving. The navigator must account for all three and yet remain still within himself. The captain approached without sound. "Well?" he asked softly. "We remain true," I answered. He looked upward for a long moment as though measuring the heavens without instrument. "It is a strange comfort," he said, "to trust what we cannot touch." "We touch it through number," I replied. He nodded once. "See that the numbers remain faithful." After he departed, I remained at the rail longer than required, tracing the arc of the constellations as they advanced slowly westward. The sea beneath reflected faint starlight in scattered glimmers. Phosphorescent streaks trailed our wake, igniting briefly before fading into darkness. The crew slept more deeply that night. Perhaps the calm had eased their restlessness. Perhaps endurance had matured into acceptance. Whatever the cause, the deck held a quieter tone. Footsteps were softer, voices lower. In the stillness, I found myself recalling earlier voyages, shorter passages along the Mediterranean coast when land remained visible even at distance. In those days, I had relied too heavily upon shoreline shape and familiar markers. Fog had once concealed those guides for 3 consecutive days, forcing me to navigate by estimation alone. The unease of that lesson had never fully departed. The Atlantic had refined that early discomfort into discipline. By the 60th day, heat rose steadily from the planks by mid-morning. The air carried weight. The crew moved with shirts loosened where modesty permitted. Water rations were monitored more closely now. Not from scarcity, but from foresight. Flying fish had grown common enough to no longer draw comment. Near noon, faint strands of sargassum drifted past the hull in intermittent clusters. Not dense, not continuous, but present. Their colour contrasted against the darker blue, subtle, yet undeniable. I did not alter course. Instead, I allowed the information to rest in quiet confirmation. Later that afternoon, a solitary seabird circled high above the mast, then disappeared toward the southwest. Its appearance drew a few upward glances, nothing more. One bird proves nothing. Yet absence had defined our crossing thus far. Presence, however slight, altered that condition. As evening approached, the wind steadied once more from the east, filling canvas with quiet insistence. The vessel leaned with renewed confidence. The wake brightened faintly beneath gathering starlight. The sea remained vast. But something within it had begun to shift. We sailed on. By the 63rd day beyond the coast of Spain, the Atlantic had altered in a manner so gradual that no single moment marked its transition. The swell, once long and cool in tone, had softened into a broader, warmer rhythm. The air carried a thickness that lingered upon the skin even before noon. The light itself seemed less severe, diffused through a faint haze that persisted above the horizon. The sea no longer felt austere. It felt inhabited, not by land, not by visible structure, but by warmth. Morning rose gently, without sharp brilliance. The sun lifted itself through pale cloud that thinned as the day advanced, casting the surface in muted gold rather than cold silver. I stood at the rail before the crew stirred fully and watched the swell approach in long measured arcs. Each crest carried a slight translucence near its peak, sunlight filtering through the thin lip before it folded back into the trough. The vessel responded without protest. She had grown accustomed to this water. I cast the log line with deliberate calm, counting the interval of sand with steady breath. The line paid out, then returned, wet and heavy. The number announced was consistent with our established pace. We were neither slowed nor hastened, and yet the sensation of progress had altered. The crew rose with subdued energy. Movements were steady, but the heat encouraged economy. Shirts were loosened, sleeves rolled. A few men poured water over their heads at the rail, drawing quiet laughter from those nearby. No reprimand followed. Discipline had matured beyond such minor expressions. The captain observed from a distance. He rarely interfered with harmless relief. By mid-morning, the deck planks warmed noticeably beneath the hand. The air carried faint scents not present earlier in the voyage, subtle traces of vegetation borne perhaps by distant currents. The sargassum appeared again, more frequent now, drifting past in scattered mats that caught briefly in the wake before dissolving behind us. I crouched near the rail and watched the strands slip along the hull. They moved with purpose, guided by forces unseen beneath the surface. Currents announce proximity long before land consents to reveal itself. I did not speak this aloud. Instead, I recorded water temperature once more and noted its continued rise. That afternoon the sea flattened slightly, though not into calm. The swell retained its breadth, but its cresting softened. The sound against the hull diminished to a quieter murmur. Rigging no longer hummed with constant tension, but creaked intermittently as the wind adjusted by degrees, almost too small to measure. The captain joined me near the helm. "You feel it," he said. "Yes." "What do you make of it?" "Transition," I replied. He nodded once, accepting the word without further inquiry. Below deck, fatigue had given way to a more tempered endurance. The earlier restlessness had dissolved. In its place remained a subdued anticipation, though none dared articulate it directly. Even the youngest sailors had ceased counting days. The crossing had extended beyond novelty into condition. Now, change approached not with impatience, but with quiet expectancy. At sunset, the sky deepened into a richer palette than we had yet witnessed. Amber near the horizon, rose above, then violet, ascending toward night. The sea mirrored those tones in muted reflection. The wake trailed luminous streaks as darkness gathered, phosphorescence brightening with each turn of the rudder. I remained on deck long after the evening watch had settled. The stars emerged slowly, veiled at first by thin haze, then clearing with deliberate patience. I raised the sextant and aligned the instrument against a horizon steadier than many nights before. The vessel's motion had grown more predictable, the swell less erratic. Readings came cleaner. Latitude confirmed our steady southing earlier in the voyage and our resumed westing now. I marked each figure with careful script. Numbers do not excite the spirit, but they steady it. The captain approached once more. "Will we see birds soon?" he asked. "Likely," I answered. "And after birds, other signs." He rested his hands upon the rail and looked into darkness. "Men sleep more soundly when they sense approach," he said. "Approach requires no announcement," I replied. "Only confirmation." He gave the faintest sound of agreement and withdrew. Night deepened fully. The sky, cleared now of haze, revealed constellations more sharply than before. Southern stars had climbed higher above the horizon. The familiar northern guides sat lower, steady but diminished in altitude. I traced their arcs with quiet satisfaction. Navigation in these waters demands attention not only to position, but to pattern. The heavens alter subtly with latitude. One must recalibrate instinct accordingly. Below deck, the air had grown warm enough that sleep required effort. I returned briefly to my cabin and unfolded the letter once more. "My dear Isabel, the sea has softened. The air carries warmth that lingers after sunset. We remain disciplined and in good health. There are signs, small ones, that suggest transition, though I will not name them until certainty allows it." I paused, considering whether such restraint was necessary in a letter that would not reach her for months. Even in ink, I prefer caution. I wrote of the crew's steadier mood, of the captain's reserved confidence, of the stars shifting gently overhead. I wrote that distance has a way of refining patience, rather than exhausting it. I sealed the page and extinguished the lantern. On the 65th day, the first sustained presence of seabirds appeared. Not a solitary wanderer, not a passing arc, but 3 small turns that circled the mast repeatedly before veering southwest in coordinated flight. Their wings cut the air with confident motion. They did not linger long, yet their repetition was unmistakable. The crew noticed. A murmur passed along the deck. No one spoke of land, but glances increased toward the horizon. I said nothing. Instead, I continued the morning log as before. The Atlantic had not ended, but it had begun to thin. We sailed on. By the 70th day of open water, the Atlantic no longer felt endless in the way it once had. Its vastness remained, but its character had altered. Where earlier weeks carried a sensation of pure expanse, now the sea seemed inhabited by subtle indication, as though distance itself were thinning. Nothing visible confirmed this impression, yet something in the motion of water and air suggested proximity to change. The swell had shifted again. It no longer approached in perfectly uniform arcs from the east. A secondary motion had begun to ride beneath it, faint but perceptible, a cross-current moving at slight variance to our heading. The vessel compensated naturally, her hull adjusting in small degrees that only experienced hands would recognize. I felt it through the rail before I observed it with the eye. Currents speak quietly. I tested the water at dawn with a lowered bucket and found its warmth increased beyond earlier measures. The surface temperature held steady at a level that would have seemed improbable weeks before. Heat rose from the deck planks earlier each morning. The air carried weight that lingered against the lungs, not unpleasant, but full. Sargassum appeared in broader fields now, not dense enough to impede progress, yet unmistakably more frequent. The strands drifted past in quiet procession, their golden threads catching light before slipping beneath our stern. Small crabs clung to the mats, startled briefly by the vessel's passage before vanishing again into floating shelter. The crew noticed, not with speech, but with attention. Seabirds increased in number over successive days. At first, 2 or 3 would circle high and depart. Then, small groups began to appear in the morning hours, tracing arcs above the mast before orienting southwestward. Their flight carried purpose. They did not wander aimlessly as earlier solitary visitors had done. One of the younger sailors stood beside me at the rail as 3 terns crossed our wake in tight formation. "They return somewhere," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Then somewhere exists. It always has." He considered this without further question. The captain approached later that afternoon, his gaze lingering upon the western horizon, longer than usual. "You calculate land?" he asked quietly. "I calculate transition," I answered. "Distance? Reduced?" He nodded once, satisfied not with certainty, but with trajectory. The sky that evening carried a faint discoloration near the horizon, almost imperceptible, unless studied with care. A slight deepening of blue toward green, so subtle it might have been dismissed as imagination. I did not dismiss it. The scent in the air altered gradually as well. Salt remained dominant, yet beneath it lay a trace of something organic, carried intermittently upon the wind. Not constant, not strong, but present. I did not announce it. The sea tests patience even at the edge of arrival. That night the stars shone through scattered cloud that moved in thin, elongated bands. I took my readings with deliberate calm, aware that approach invites overconfidence. The altitude of Polaris confirmed our position within expected variance. The southern stars climbed fractionally higher. We were where we intended to be, yet confirmation requires repetition. The following day brought increased bird activity. 5, then 7, then a small flock that lingered longer than any before. They circled the mast repeatedly, their calls sharp but not frantic. One settled briefly upon the yardarm before lifting again toward the southwest. The crew gathered small observations into private understanding. Conversation quieted when birds appeared. Eyes followed their direction. Below deck, preparations altered subtly. Water casks were inspected with renewed attention. Equipment secured more carefully than routine required. No order had been given. The crossing itself had instructed them. On the 73rd day, the swell shortened unexpectedly near midday. Not a storm swell, not turbulence, but a compression of wave pattern, as though the sea encountered resistance beyond sight. The vessel's motion altered slightly, rising and descending in quicker intervals. I recalculated drift and leeway with careful conservatism. The compass remained faithful. The captain joined me at the helm. "You feel it," he said. "Yes." "Shoals?" "Not yet," I replied, "but influence." He did not press further. The afternoon brought a more persistent scent carried upon steady wind. Vegetation unmistakable now, though faint. The kind of aroma that cannot originate from open water alone. A murmur passed along the deck. No land was visible. The horizon remained clear and unbroken. Yet expectation compressed the air more than heat. I instructed the helmsman to maintain strict adherence to heading. Approach temps deviation. I would not allow eagerness to alter discipline. As dusk descended, the western sky deepened to amber, then violet. A slight haze gathered low upon the horizon, darker than cloud, yet not defined. I studied it through narrowed eyes. Clouds move. This did not. Still, distance can distort perception. I marked its bearing quietly in the log. The crew sensed my scrutiny. No one asked. Night came fully, obscuring whatever had lingered at the edge of sight. The stars resumed dominion overhead. I took my readings with greater care than usual, confirming position twice before closing the book. If land lay ahead, it would reveal itself at dawn. We slept in suspended certainty. The Atlantic had not ended, but it had begun to narrow. We sailed on. On the 74th morning, beyond Spain, I rose before the bell, and not from habit alone, but from a quiet awareness that sleep had thinned. The air carried a weight different from previous dawns. It was not cooler nor warmer, but altered, as though something beyond sight influenced its character. The sky remained dark when I stepped upon the deck. Only a faint band of paling light marked the eastern horizon. To the west, darkness held longer, dense and indistinct. The sea moved beneath us in shortened arcs, its motion subtly compressed compared to earlier weeks. The helmsman stood steady, eyes forward. "Any change?" I asked quietly. "None seen," he replied. I walked to the rail and narrowed my gaze toward the western horizon. At first there was nothing, only the familiar division of sea and sky. Yet after several long breaths I perceived a faint irregularity along the line. Not height, not shape. A subtle deepening of tone, darker than cloud, yet without the definition of storm. Clouds shift. This held. I said nothing. Anticipation is dangerous when voiced prematurely. The captain emerged moments later, coat loosely fastened, expression unreadable. "You are awake early," he observed. "As are you." He followed my gaze westward. "You see it?" "I see difference," I replied. We stood in silence as the eastern sky brightened incrementally. Light expanded behind us first, washing the sea in pale silver before advancing westward. The darker band ahead remained fixed. Bird calls reached us faintly, more numerous than any morning before. Small shapes crossed above the mast in deliberate flight, not wandering but purposeful. The crew stirred slowly, sensing the altered tone before understanding its cause. Movement along the deck increased, conversations hushed. As the sun broke free of the horizon, its light stretched long across the water toward the west. The faint irregularity sharpened by degrees. What had seemed merely shadow now revealed slight elevation, a discontinuity in the perfect arc of sea. Land does not rise dramatically from distance. It accumulates definition. A low ridge became perceptible, then another beyond it. The haze that had obscured shape began to thin under strengthening light. Green emerged faintly within the darker line. No one shouted. The first confirmation of land is not noise. It is stillness. The captain exhaled slowly. "Well done," he said, though the words were not triumph, but acknowledgement. "We are not yet there," I replied. He nodded. "No. But we are no longer nowhere." Relief passed through the crew, not as celebration, but as release. Shoulders eased, glances exchanged. One of the younger sailors crossed himself quietly near the rail. I returned to the helm. "Maintain course," I instructed. "Approach tempts alteration." The sea ahead altered in colour as distance diminished. The deep indigo of open Atlantic shifted gradually toward layered blues and greens. Swell patterns grew more complex, refracting subtly as they encountered unseen contours beneath the surface. The vessel's motion changed. Where earlier she had risen and fallen in broad, uninterrupted arcs, now she encountered slight resistance from beneath, an undercurrent reflecting from distant shoals. I recalculated depth estimation based on water coloration and swell behavior. "Soundings will begin within the hour," I said quietly to the captain. He inclined his head. The crew's focus sharpened. Tasks were performed with renewed attention, lines inspected, sails adjusted with greater precision. No one wished to mar the final approach through carelessness. Birds increased in number steadily. Their cries, once distant, now layered the air with sharp clarity. Some descended low over the water, skimming the surface before lifting toward the coastline. The scent strengthened. Vegetation unmistakable now. Warm, green, alive. The Atlantic had narrowed to channel. We advanced cautiously. and still I felt no elation. Land demands as much discipline as sea. We sailed on.